Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started if that works for you, Caleb, and for you, Ruben.
No problem.
Okay, great. Well, again, my name is James Austin. I'm from Central Connecticut State University. I'm presenting on the panel, but I'm also functioning as chair for this panel, which is L.4, WAC as a locus for cultural and pedagogical change. I'll be presenting second today. Our first presenter, Ruben Mora from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. I apologize for my bad accent, but I tried my best.
Don't worry, that's good.
Implementing genre pedagogy and advanced EFL writing courses. Ruben's going to talk to us about the findings of a study conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of genre pedagogy in undergraduate essays at his university. It's based in systemic functional linguistics. After Ruben's presentation, it'll be my turn. You'll see my recording. Mine is topic selection and creative nonfiction writers in Egypt, implications for global WAC. My presentation is a little different than the text here, but I think hopefully better. And then there'll be some time at the end for questions. With that said, I think we're going to start the script. I'm really excited that you two, Bethany and Megan, are here. Hope others show. And we'll take it from here. Okay, Caleb, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. My name is Ruben Mora, and I work at the National School of Languages, Linguistics, and Translation at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And I'm here to share the study that I conducted as part of my master's degree. The way the presentation is organized is first, I will give you a little bit of the background of the pedagogy, then a brief explanation of the teaching learning cycle, the TLC, and finally the study and I will talk about the design and the results that we obtained. So starting with the pedagogy, the backbone is Halliday Systemic Functional Linguistics. Martin and Rose started a series of action research projects and programs in Australia in the early 80s in order to help students that were in elementary school whose outcomes were not the best when it came to reading and writing. And these students came from the working class and they were Aboriginal students. So they used Halliday's SFL, Systemic Functional Linguistics, and a lot of the concepts in it in order to develop this way of teaching reading and writing in particular. Nowadays, the pedagogy has been implemented around the globe in all the different countries that you can see on the map. Mexico is one of them, and I'm one of them doing it. Highland talks about 3 different approaches to teaching writing, and the present study has taken 3 of the strands that Highland points out. One of them is text as discourse, and this is where genres come in, writing as a cognitive process, and this is process writing with students writing several drafts. And also writing as social construction, and this is where the TLC, the teaching learning cycle, comes in. There are several advantages to the pedagogy, 2 of which I would like to highlight. One of them is that it's empowering because it helps students to have access to the patterns, to the possibilities of variation of texts that are valued. And this in turn allows them to be critical about them and challenge them. So I believe those are quite important to point out. More specifically, Rose and Martin say that the pedagogy is directed, again, like I said, to help those students who were at some sort of disadvantage. And of course, it's also about helping teachers give them the tools that they need in order to help students get better results. Now, what is a genre? This is Martin and Rose's definition. Genres are social because we participate in genres with other people. They're goal-oriented because we use them to get something done. And they're staged because it usually takes us a few steps in order to get whatever it is that we want to get. So I think it's important we know what a genre is. The TLC, it's divided into 4 stages, and I would like to mention that as a teacher, your role is to move students along the 4 different stages, but at any point you can go back or stay in one of the stages for as long as it's necessary according to the student's needs. The first of them is the preparation stage. This is negotiating field. There's a focus on vocabulary, and basically what it's about is about activating previous knowledge or building new knowledge in case it's necessary. And of course, building and organizing the experience, which will help them when later they analyze the text. And this will take us to the deconstruction stage, which is also preparation 1. This is where students use model texts to study the internal structure of the text, and they identify things such as field and tenor, mode. All of these are basic concepts of systemic functional linguistics. The focus now is more on grammar and on the different options that language has for students, and that they will choose from in order to convey whatever meanings they want to convey in the genre that they are working with. Then there's one of the production stages, which is joint construction. And this is where students write text in small teams or as a whole class. Different drafts could be written. And this is where the appropriation of the genre begins to take place. Later on, and this is again all helping for students when they reach independent construction, which is also a production stage. And now every student will write his or her own text. And this is where the teacher's role becomes essential, because he or she will continuously be monitoring them and checking them and giving them feedback on comments and corrections about the different drafts that they are writing. And towards the end of the course, and some students may decide to put together an individual portfolio, which is what happened in this study, or the whole class can put together a class anthology or a magazine using all the different texts that were written throughout the course. Now, it is important to mention that this collaboration between students and also between teacher and student has to do with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, with the notions of the shared consciousness and borrowed consciousness. Shared consciousness, the idea is that working with others is actually more efficient than working on your own. And borrowed consciousness has to do with working with someone else, with a knowledgeable other, and this will actually help those who are not as knowledgeable to have a better grasp of the task itself or the ideas that they are trying to appropriate. Now, the study, the design and the results, this was mixed methods, experimental or intervention design. It was divided into 4 stages, the first of which was a quasi-experimental study. We had an experimental group of which I was in charge of. There were 2 control groups, and we produced a corpus in 2 different phases, before and after the implementation, phases 1 and 2. The implementation itself took about 14 weeks, and students had to write 3 stories and 3 essays. The kind of essays, the task 2, TOEFL, IBT, and IELTS type of essays. And the questions both before and after were very similar in the sense that they were asking students to give their opinion about what they consider would be the best present to help a child develop, or this was for phase 1, or for a teenager to develop, which was for phase 2. At the end, we had 60 essays, 30 from phase 1 and 30 from phase 2. Then during stage 2 of the study, I conducted qualitative interviews to the control group teachers in order to use that information and at a later stage find similarities with the pedagogy that I implemented. I also conducted a structural analysis of the corpus and also developed excuse me, an assessment criteria, a set of assessment criteria based on what Rose and Martin had proposed. We had 32 criteria, and these were used in order to determine the scores of each of the essays that were written both in phase 1 and in phase 2. And finally, in stage 4 of the study, we put everything together in order to determine the role of the implementation. This is an example of the structural analysis that I conducted. This is for student 4 in the experimental group, before and after. And as you can see, the text before was divided into 3, whereas the text after was divided into 5 paragraphs. And the information was just not as clearly organized in the before as in the after, as in phase 1, as in phase 2. In phase 2, it was very clear how in the introduction they had a thesis and the arguments that they were going to develop, or this particular student, I'm sorry, and how in the main body in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, he or she dedicated the whole of the information to that particular argument. And then, of course, in the conclusion, in paragraph 5, there was a paraphrase of it. So once we did the whole structural analysis, we found there were certain patterns of content and organization. And these were the 3 different patterns. They look very similar, but there were slight, important differences. We classified all of the corpus, and this is for group A, for the experimental one. And notice that about half of them in phase 1 are either in pattern 3, in the combination of patterns, or there was just no combination. They could not fit into any of the patterns. But compared to phase 2, after the implementation, all of the essays could be easily classified in patterns 1, 2, and 3, and none of them were a combination or were not able to be classified. With the criteria that we developed, this is what we obtained as far as the scores go. And as you can see, all of the phase 2 essays had a higher score. When compared to the control groups, it was pretty obvious that group A had a higher improvement, or actually improved. But we knew from the structural analysis that something was not right. And indeed, when we divided groups B and C, well, group B did improve, not as much, slightly less than group A, but group C had actually no improvement at all. And these are the differences per criterion. And once again, all of the criteria actually improved, except for 2 numbers, 26 and 29, which actually went down a little bit. And these are the top 5 criteria with the most improvement, and all of them have to do with organizing ideas, with providing a thesis, with paraphrasing it, and topic sentences in the main body. The criteria were organized in groups, and these are the top 5 groups that showed the most improvement. And phases, stages, and purpose, again, have to do with the organization of the ideas in the text. This is a recap of what we saw, and I would like to point out that 30 of the 32 criteria showed an improvement. And this was, of course, we believe this had to do with implementing the pedagogy. So what we would like to conclude is that the pedagogy is effective. It helps in the organization of ideas and arguments in the essay. The students were able to provide not only a thesis, but also paraphrase it. They also were able to give and summarize main ideas, and to also include topic and supporting sentences in their main body paragraphs, something that just did not happen before the implementation. Again, this is based on Rose and Martin's proposal, their teaching learning cycle, and the joint writing, which is this stage where students work together and where the teacher also works with the students. and the notions of shared and borrowed consciousness that I have already explained. This is where they come into play. And this is why joint writing has been considered an innovation of the pedagogy. And if you are familiar with Halliday's theory of learning based on language, in which he explains how a child interacting with his or her caregiver, be it mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, and that the child learns through this social interaction, not only about language, but about the world itself. This is the basic principle behind the teaching learning cycle. These are my references. Thank you very much for listening. And in case you want to contact me, this is my email, rubenmora@enal.unam.mx. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruben. I believe that, yes, nicely done. Thank you very much. I believe Caleb, our IWAC conference coordinator, Caleb is going to load up mine. And after my presentation is finished, both Ruben and myself will be available for any questions that you have. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to my presentation, Topic Selection in Creative Nonfiction Writers in Egypt, Implications for Global WAC. That's me, James P. Austin. I'm from Central Connecticut State University. I'm a professor there. I teach writing and literature. I also administer within the composition program some of our basic writing courses. The presentation that you'll hear from me today is drawn from my experience as an MFA student a long time ago, as a doctoral student and now professor whose background is in writing studies with an education focus. I have a PhD in education. And I also spent 4 years living in Egypt, teaching writing, teaching creative nonfiction, and administering a writing minor during my time there. So this presentation draws all of that together for you here. The driving questions for this presentation are as follows. How do we define CNF, or creative nonfiction as I'm calling it? What's the benefit to conceptualizing creative nonfiction as a form of literacy using a new literacy studies framework? How can creative nonfiction's unique qualities to literacy inform approaches to WAC? And what special opportunities and challenges are presented through teaching Western-based creative nonfiction literacies in non-Western contexts, especially as that pertains to WAC? So with that in mind, I think the first thing that we have to do is define creative nonfiction's epistemological principles. And I'm using that phrase, epistemological principles, for a reason that will become clear to you in the next slide. And I just looked up a few sources here to give us a working definition of what we mean by creative nonfiction. And for those of you who have familiarity with creative nonfiction, these should come as no surprise to you. Personal presence, a subjectivity of the writer, making statements about reality, self-discovery and exploration, formal flexibility, the use of literary techniques, and as you can see, other things: intimacy, sincerity, candor, honesty, and as Lopate says, a certain unity to human experience, and a close, if not intimate, relationship with the reader that demands honesty. So I want you, if you can, I know it's a lot of information, to try to hold that definition in your mind as we move on to the next slide, because this is like the first piece that we're moving in together here. And this is the definition of literacy from a new literacy studies perspective. That's an interdisciplinary field that ranges from education studies to English studies. The late Brian Street wrote in 2003 that an ideological take on literacy posits instead that literacy is a social practice, not simply a technical or neutral skill. So when we teach creative nonfiction, we're not just teaching technique, we're teaching an approach that is always embedded in socially constructed epistemological principles. There's that phrase. It is about knowledge. The ways in which people address reading and writing are themselves rooted in conceptualizations of knowledge, identity, and being. And if we toggle back here, I think that's what this is about, a lot of this. It's embedded in social practices, such as those of a particular job market or a particular educational context, or in the world of literature and creative writing, or even wider cultures. Now, one of the things I'm going to posit here is we can do things with creative nonfiction if we think of it as something a little bit different than just an area of creative writing. It's got broader applications. But I do want to point out the relationship of literacy, not just to individuals writing with it, but the fact that it's contextually and culturally based. So it has rules of the road that no one person invents, but it also has, in any context, some limits to it. So I want to keep a creative nonfiction definition and definition of literacy in mind as we move forward. And I want to talk a little bit about transfer now, an important concept that informs a lot of practice in first-year writing, and I think is good for WAC too. Elizabeth Wardle in a study explained that students in the study and her analysis were unwilling to put forth the effort required to transfer learning into more complex writing. And that's the whole idea of first-year writing, and I think writing across the curriculum, that we can take an integrated stance on college-level writing, and that something that's happening in one place can transfer over into another place. But she's saying it's not happening, and many first-year writing scholars have made that same critique. But interestingly, she blames writing instructors for failing to provide the conditions that are going to motivate students to do that. So she puts the burden on instructors. And this has a lot to do with motive and motivation. And that's a key dispositional quality of writing transfer, according to Driscoll and Wells, and an emerging area of interest in literacy studies. Jonathan Alexander points out the active nature of literacy learning, which casts a crucial focus on the learner's motives and actions alongside contextual concerns. And I want to keep that as another pillar we're sliding into place here too. The relationship of an individual's path through space with the context within which they're moving, and how to pay attention to both at the same time. Driscoll and Wells argue that individual dispositions such as motive, value, self-efficacy are important to successful writing transfer. And these are directly taken from their article, but I've highlighted a few key areas here that I would also ask us as we're building up creative nonfiction and global WAC, keep them in mind. They're part of a larger system that includes the person, the context, and the process through which learning is going to happen, which includes time. It's not just about discrete knowledge, skills, or aptitudes, but how they're used or applied. And that brings us back to the relationship between individual and context. They determine students' sensitivity towards and willingness to engage in forms of transfer. I think that's critical as well. What can we do to help students be sensitive to, be willing to engage in transfer, and to see the value in it beyond even just completing an assignment for a grade? And they may be both context specific or broadly generalized. So they can be two things at the same time. So let's say a little bit more about dispositions. Driscoll and Wells, they raise a lot of questions about the way teachers can positively impact student dispositions, leaving us some breadcrumbs for this panel here. These are some of the questions they feature. Again, this is drawn directly from their article, but I've highlighted in purple some things that I think might be relevant here. What's the role of curricular interventions in shifting dispositions? So what can we do with curriculum? You know, can disruptive dispositions be shifted within a single writing course? Can we do that? If so, how? Can we teach students in a way that encourages transfer-oriented and generative dispositions? Can we encourage that set of conditions? And how are they shaped by the system that a learner inhabits? So I want to keep these questions in mind as well as we're building more knowledge. And in a way, I'm glad this is recorded so that if any of you find what we're saying here valuable, you can toggle back through and play back the recording, whatever parts are relevant or interesting to you. So, hey, what does this have to do with creative nonfiction and WAC? Well, as I said, creative nonfiction as a social practice, as a form of literacy, is predicated upon the principles described by those creative nonfiction scholars from slide 4. All those things that they list out, which I'll get back to in a little while, are all forms of literacy, as I described earlier. Okay. Interestingly, though creative nonfiction does something unique. It has the appeal of creative and self-sponsored expression, but it's within a disciplined form of literacy. And all literature itself is like that. If you're a poet or a fiction writer, or in this case, a creative nonfiction writer, you're operating within a paradigm. There is a standard. There are ways to do it. It means something to a particular audience in a particular place at a particular time. So there is that disciplined form of literacy, and yet what you also have with creative nonfiction is an individual moving through space, telling a story. So it's creative and it's self-sponsored. And whether it has to do with reading or writing, I think it's a very valuable weapon that we can use to help students see the value in transfer. In fact, I argue that students may be more disposed to do transfer work across the curriculum if creative nonfiction is integrated into their reading and writing. Now, this is a little off focus here, but I would say that I think it's a good idea to do experimental studies or curricular interventions across the curriculum. They should be sponsored, conducted, reported on, so that we can see the way in which creative nonfiction can be utilized. Now, this isn't the end of the presentation. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the things that I've done here stateside, and then my experiences abroad, that I think lend creative nonfiction and WAC in an international context a very interesting potential. In my Writing 100 class, that's the Fundamentals of Composition at Central Connecticut State University. It's basic writing. One of the things I teach is this essay by Jimmy Santiago Baca, Coming into Language, which you can find online. I read it because it's a great story about somebody learning to read and write against odds, against great odds. But another reason why I do it is because it's something that students will enjoy. And because they're enjoying it and they're taken in more by reading this stuff than I would say academic prose, especially early in college, they're going to read it, and then I can point them to the different types of sentences that Baca is using. He uses narration, he uses figurative language, and then he uses like insight or commentary language. And so what I do after they read this is I have created this worksheet where this sort of thing is going on here. And I point out where I see these things happening. Blue is narration, yellow is figurative language, and green is insight. And one of the things I want to do with having them read creative nonfiction is introduce this idea of sentence types, that different types of sentences do different kinds of work. Now, you know, if you're sitting here listening to this, that's true for all kinds of writing across the curriculum. But I think we need to dispose them to seeing that that's true. That's something that's worth it for them to know and to practice. So I point this out to them, and then later in the worksheet, I give them a paragraph from Baca, which ostensibly they've already read, and have them try the same thing to try to identify these things. And also, a little Trojan horse I have in this assignment is I also have them read the verbs. We got, if you look through this one, you've got mopping, kneed, handcuffed, raked, laughed, kicked, walked, and then shot, grabbed, and tucked. Very strong, specific verbs, and that allows me to also show these students who I think have read something that they value and care about, the power of a strong vocabulary and of verbs to carry a lot of weight. So again, I see this not because I'm trying to turn them into nonfiction writers, but because I want to dispose them to understanding and accepting that there are different kinds of sentences that do different kinds of things. And then once we move forward from this assignment and do other things, well then I keep talking about sentence types, but the types of sentences and the types of genres we're writing in begin to change and shift, but I carry that, and I think that I'm more disposed to do that. So that's one thing that I do where it comes to creative nonfiction and dispositional thinking among students. But this is an international running across the curriculum conference, and I have international experience. So I want to add in these international considerations as important variables. Creative nonfiction is in fact culturally bound, and in this case tends to express Western-based values like personal presence, like making subjective statements about reality. Not all cultures would support that kind of thinking. Likewise, self-discovery and self-exploration. These are important Western values, particularly American values, and they may not always be accepted in other parts of the world, and certainly they won't necessarily be read in the same way, but that's not necessarily bad. And Lopate presupposes a certain unity to human experience, which is an interesting hypothetical statement, but we would need nonfiction and personal essays from all over the world to know for sure. And even general characteristics of creative nonfiction literacies can be defined differently according to culture, like sincerity, honesty. Those all mean different things, and they're all expressed in different ways. So when we're seeing the definition of creative nonfiction's principles, if we see it as a form of literacy, we see it as contextually bound. However, one of the things that's going on with global WAC, global composition, any kind of global writing, is what happens when you take these forms of literacy and even the transfer-based, dispositional-based approaches I was just talking about, and you put them into other parts of the world. It's just not that simple to say it's going to work the same way. However, I've cited a few sources here: Renesi, Fields and Carter, Arnold et al. They found that students in the MENA, the Middle East, North Africa, they were drawn in by Western-based creative literacy, either in class or through literacy events like poetry readings. And they found some value in doing some of the creative expression that you might associate with the West. And so that raises an important question about why and what's valuable about that. So if we recall Alexander's focus on the active nature of literacy learning, it underscores that students are the shapers of literacies, not simply their passive vessels. So if you introduce creative nonfiction with all of its Western values into a place like Egypt, where I worked for 4 years, you might find that students pick that torch up and do some interesting things with it. And if we pay attention to those things, we might be able to find some value in how creative nonfiction can be used to support WAC in global contexts. Now, my former chair and associate chair, Emily Golson, and the great Lambert Holdyke from the American University in Cairo found that creative nonfiction tapped into a hidden need for attention to creative expression. And I wrote a little bit about this a few years ago. And when I interviewed a person who had been one of my colleagues, a creative nonfiction teacher, this is what she said about that creative expression. I thought was fascinating. When one student wrote about his atheist beliefs, I write, this teacher was initially concerned that she was going to have to protect the student from critique by his Muslim and Coptic Christian classmates, some of whom were quite devout. Instead, she observed the seriousness and curiosity of these students during discussion, which focused on the merits of their writing and not disagreements with the student's ideology. More important than that, she learned that these young Egyptians were eager for opportunities to acknowledge and discuss complex religious, ideological, and cultural dilemmas that were not typically addressed in Egyptian society. I should say Egyptian society is a friendly, dialogic place full of conversation, but not all topics are ripe for a public conversation. So in the small public of a creative nonfiction workshop, it was brave of the student to write about atheism in a place where nobody's really supposed to be atheist. When I saw that this writer had something to say and wanted to start a conversation about Egypt and not simply reflect Western values in the doing, and actually sparked a conversation among other young Egyptians. And again, this has something to do with WAC, and I want to get to that. In my own teaching, my AUC students wrote stirring nonfiction accounts of many things. These are a few: parental illness and the cultural stigma of it, endemic sexual harassment, visiting Mecca, and experiencing simultaneously what's called the compound culture in Saudi Arabia, which is, Saudi's a very conservative country. It's where Mecca is at. People go on the Hajj there. The student went to the Hajj. She went to Mecca, and then she went and visited some wealthy friends who lived in these walled-off compounds with Westerners and wealthy Saudis, and she found that the rules there were quite different. Saudis, any devout Muslim isn't supposed to, smoke or drink or gamble. They're supposed to be modest. And she found that behind the compound walls, none of those things were true. And she had a lot of interesting reflections on that. So what I found is that student writers used Western-based creative nonfiction literacy as a launching point to address suppressed desire for public discourse in a culture that often prefers acquiescence to cultural norms. So what? Well, to me, creative nonfiction literacies cast a crucial light on the topics students want to write about and the attitudes they express on these topics. And topic selection and attitude expression, whether it be creative nonfiction or something else, and these are transferable, they exist at the nexus of individual interest and desire and what a particular literacy, educational, or cultural context allows, which I think is an important dispositional concept. Again, something happening at an individual level versus a macro level. And I believe we can teach topic and attitude as transferable traits, helping students understand and evaluate the symbiotic nature of writer and context, which to me is a form of rhetorical thinking that is durable across contexts. And I think that we can use creative nonfiction to begin to do that. In fact, I just say here, we can use self-sponsored writing like creative nonfiction to engage students into becoming more sensitive toward and willing to engage in literacy learning. And I can simply say, when I was a doctoral student myself, in all of my classes at Charles Baserman at midterm, we wrote some sort of personal story about the subject matter of the class before writing a more traditional seminar paper at the end. And sure, I brought in some creative writing background. Many students didn't have that kind of background. But I think we were still asked to bring in our personal experiences. I'm asking for us to think about doing that, but in these kinds of ways. And just to conclude, I'm just bringing us back to these dispositions here and saying, the person, the context, and the process, time, these are all things that I think that can be encouraged through the use of creative nonfiction literacies to cast a light on topic selection, attitude expression, what the individual wants and what the context can do, and the rhetorical dexterity you can grow from that. In addition to my other ideas about locating and identifying a sentence type. So I believe that can be built out in bigger ways, not just in the sentence at the sentence level, but in bigger ways with different forms of literacy. And I would at the Academy, and I would conclude by simply saying, I think we can think about the conditions that we can create through using, reading, or writing creative nonfiction in our classes across curriculum. I think it works globally. I think it works in the United States. So I'm going to yield my time here because I'm just about at 22 minutes. I'll stop sharing. And thank you for your time. And I look forward to any questions you may have at the conclusion of this panel. Okay, well, that was me a few weeks ago. Thanks, Megan, and thanks to Ruben. Thanks to Ruben as well for his presentation. We have some time. I'm sure would both be eager to respond to any questions or simply hear what you have to think or what you're thinking about. If you got any ideas that have come up, we could chat about. So I'm kind of, because I'm chairing, I'm kind of running this part. So if you, I guess, raise your hands, maybe we can do it that way. We'd love to hear from you. Bethany, hi. Yeah, go ahead and unmute. Thanks. Hi.
Perfect. Hi, thank you. Thank you for the great presentation, both of you. Something that piqued my interest, I guess, as I kind of think, I'm an incoming graduate teaching assistant at Colorado State University, so I'll be teaching their their entry-level composition class this fall, which is super exciting. I've been reading the textbook, and there's a vast number of articles that I think are super important, but definitely, create a lot of opportunity for divisiveness, for that kind of shielding off, that argumentative. I'm curious, I guess, something that you said really made me think about this. In Egypt, there's kind of a time and a place for a lot of these things. And I feel like America is kind of becoming ever more like, oh, we don't talk about that. Like, you can't talk about politics, you can't talk about religion, you can't talk about any of that because you'll offend someone, and it turns into this like explosive thing. So I would just be curious, I guess, like on your thoughts. Is that a pattern we're seeing in the academy, or just like in life outside of academia, and kind of addressing that and taking kind of, I guess, some tips for how to encourage that. And thankfully our syllabus does have some more creative functions to it. And I hope to employ some of what's been talked about here today, but I would just be curious on your thoughts there.
Well, you've got two I think experienced writing teachers here on the panel, so we'll probably both have something to say. Can I ask what program you're going to be in there? Are you PhD, MFA? What are you going to be doing?
So I'll be an MA student, and their program is Writing, Rhetoric, and Social Change.
Okay. And is there an expectation in that program that you might take on social issues in these classes, and that's part of your training and expectation?
Yes, yeah. And I think the training will be spectacular, especially, given like some of the stuff in these that they're wanting these freshmen to engage with is pretty hard hitting, which I think is super exciting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it could be a little messy, right?
Yeah.
That's intimidating for me. Yeah. And maybe for a new teacher. Yeah, I mean, as far as just speaking about the United States, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a free speech place, but that doesn't mean that that we're free from critique. We're going to be critiqued for some of the things that we want to say. One of the things that might be useful to think about, if you're thinking a little bit about some of what I said, is there space to get them to write about themselves a little bit at the beginning? Something I've used before, I've used it in fundamentals of composition, but in other classes, which is, again, if you can assign readings that maybe don't appear to be really controversial at first, students might be able to come along with you. Ray McDermott's Putting Literacy in Its Place is a good one. He talks about 3 generations of literacy in his family, and the kind of different functions that literacy has played for him through time. Richard Rodriguez's Hunger of Memory, aspects of that could also be good. If you want to address issues of literacy and what it is and isn't good for, why we're doing it, as a way to think about introducing or disposing students to think about the relationship between their own stories, much more so than their own opinions, maybe their own stories or the stories of their families and the things you're asking them to interact with. So that's something from me. I see that Caleb has shared our contact information. So Bethany, you can always write to me and maybe Ruben as well. So I'll stop if Ruben has more to say about that. That might be useful to Bethany.
When you were describing this, how you have students analyze the paragraph, can you just remember that you said that first there was a narration, and then they had to say, express how they felt and make some sort of reference to the senses and that kind of thing. It really reminded me of Rose and Martin, the same authors that I read, and they have this book called Genre Relations. And I would say the first two chapters, I think, have to do with stories, and they dissect stories and they classify them. And it's very, very interesting how the way that they look at it is exactly the same way that you saw it. And all of their stories have to do with Aboriginals in Australia and about a policy that they had for many, many years, which nowadays they are ashamed of. Because they separated young Aboriginals from their families in order to make them whiter, which of course nowadays it's not something, I mean, they already apologized for that. But all of the stories that they used are very, I mean, they are very, they really touch you, because they have to do with these very serious sorts of situations when a child is separated from his or her family. And I think it's an emotional outlet. It's one way of them getting things out. So if you have the chance, it's a very good book. And it does have the Australian point of view, and systemic functional linguistics is there, but like I said, I just by looking at how you analyze that paragraph, James, that's exactly the same thing that they say. They may use different names and their classification of stories may be somewhat different, but I mean, it's there. It's basically the same thing. So that could also help you, Bethany, and is really interesting.
Great. Okay, Philip, you had a question. You're muted. But hopefully
here we go.
You're still around. We'd love to.
There.
Here you go. Hi.
Yeah, sorry about that. And sorry I can't be on camera at the moment. I actually had a response to Bethany's question. I'm the WID director at George Washington University in DC. And one of the things that we've used in training grad students, we train about 40 to 60 grad students per year to go work in classrooms with faculty members. And one of the most important practices that we've started employing, and a lot of the faculty in the writing program employ too, is a sort of discussion with students at the beginning of the term about how to have difficult discussions. And I'm guessing that this is going to be part of your training at CSU there as well. But it basically involves having students sit and write for a few minutes about think about difficult conversations you've had about any topic. Maybe it's just a roommate dispute, maybe it's a parental dispute, anything. It doesn't have to be race or any of the kinds of social issues that might be discussed in the class, and make a list of practices of the conversants that were useful and productive to the conversation, that moved the conversation forward, that helped each other see a different point of view or something like that. And then make a list of things that were not productive or that were counterproductive or harmful to the discussion. And then, and that's about a 5-minute to 10-minute writing exercise, I guess. And then we discuss those, and usually I'll write them on the board while they're just calling them out, and I don't really say anything. I just write what they say. And then we kind of look at all those together and say, what questions do we have about these? Are there any of these we would move into a different category or elaborate on or add to? And then we take a picture of that, and those are our rules. And I think that goes a long way towards helping students articulate and to just establish some standards that they can hold themselves to. And one of the things that happens is that you can add your own things to that list as well, if there are things missing that you would like to add. And it might be that it may be okay for someone to say, I think we should change the topic, or I think we should come back to this tomorrow, or something like that, right? So intervening in the conversation can be one of the rules that you could have students establish for themselves. And I'm sure the other panelists here too have done similar or practices something like that in the classroom. But I think it helps students hold each other accountable too, which is one of the important components in I guess to me personally in the writing classroom, is that I do want it to be their classroom, and there may be moments where I can't in memory think of a time where it's happened where I had to shut down a conversation or say that's out of bounds. I suppose it's possible that could happen. But I think getting students to lay down the groundwork at the outset, I think is a helpful tactic.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. That sounds great. Bethany or Margie or Caleb or Philip, do you have any additional questions or concerns that Ruben and I, and really any of us could talk about?
Yeah, can I ask a question? Yeah, so, and thank you both for your presentations. I was just wondering, so I graduated from a creative nonfiction program in 2019, and so this your presentation, James, about CNF and integrating that, and just hearing some of the other presentations in this conference about students wanting to engage more with personal writing on a variety of reasons. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about like the significance or the potential for cross-disciplinary conversation between creative writing and WAC, or creative writing and those of us who are in writing studies, and sort of what can emerge from that, or not. I know that it's been a topic that many people have many thoughts on it. So yeah, I was just wondering about that.
It's, I think buy-in from the two sides. Like, part of the reason why I said what I said at the beginning is like, I have a PhD from like an ed program. So I have all these like educational methods in my head over here. Then over here, I have an MFA in fiction from UC Irvine, right? So I have both of them, and I don't feel like I need to abandon one strictly in favor of the other. Like a lot of, MFAs will eventually do that, I think. So I was always like, well, how can you put them together? And this is why I became attracted to the study of literacy and what it means. Can you get buy-in from people who write literature, not just the professional readers of literature, like literature professors, but creative writers, to acknowledge that what they're doing is a form of literacy? That's what I was trying to do in the first part of that presentation. Is like, well, these are all really culturally based values, and if we don't see it that way, we're opening ourselves up to some pretty significant forms of critique. To be like, sincerity, honesty, and well, those mean different things in different parts of the world. So, can we get buy-in from creative writing folks to see it that way? Like, I don't know, man. It's tough because I sat in creative writing workshops. It was really far away from that way of looking at writing. And I was a doe-eyed boy in his 20s back then too, so I really didn't have the tools to force that conversation. But I also realized that at least the place I was at that time, it wasn't the proper place to try to have that talk. That if I wanted to have that talk, I was going to have to create a space for myself in time that I could still write and read fiction, which I do, but also think about how it's produced and what it means a little differently. I think that you're finding more from like writing studies people, they're taking more of an interest in creative nonfiction or creative writing as a form of literacy to be studied. I'm seeing more of that. I was just reading something by Alexander Lunsford and Whithouse about wayfinding in written communication. And they were talking about creative writing was in there. It was part of what they were talking about. So I'm seeing that side of things more willing, having conversations between certain types of creative writers where they might be willing to think about it in a more left brain. Is that the logical side? The logical brain side, if they're willing to do that. And I don't really know. I would say that MFA programs probably aren't the place to have that conversation, in my opinion. I've known lots of people who went to MFA. I went to MFA. That probably isn't the place to do it, but I think that there might be some people who have creative writing experience and background who would be interested in having those kinds of conversations. And I'm kind of looking for them. Like I ran into you, Caleb, just by being part of this conference, and you reached out to me and you found it interesting. That's interesting. And I think if we can build a team of people One of the things I'll just say relevant also to Bethany is I think we're all saying this, like there's something about telling stories, whether it's Baca's story or, I'm reading The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead right now. Great book to read in a class, like maybe for you to think about. There's a way to get people to dispose them towards putting their guard down long enough to listen to what you have to say. And that's part of what I think we're talking about here. Can you encourage folks to do that long enough, especially at least in the United States, maybe everywhere? It's really, the need for that is as great as I can remember, but it also means your job is really hard. And it's going to be frustrating, but certainly telling stories, reading stories, understanding how stories are done and why they're done that way seems like it's a piece of the puzzle. I can't claim that it's an answer, but it's a piece. So I'll stop talking now. But if there are other questions, other concerns, we have a few minutes. And again, Caleb put our contact information there in the chat. And I'm sure that, and I speak as chair now, I would be happy to follow up with anyone. And I imagine Ruben would feel the same way. Are there any other closing questions or concerns here in the last couple of minutes of our panel?
Yeah, that's an applause, but I guess a raised hand as well. I wanted to thank you both for what you did here. I was late to the session, so I didn't hear all of Ruben's, unfortunately. But as an undergraduate writer and as a high school writer, I hated the personal essay. I still kind of hate it, and so it's something that I've often avoided. To me, it always felt illegitimate for the professor or teacher to ask me to say anything personal about me. To me, that seemed inappropriate to the classroom. And so that's something that I'm still sensitive to, but I would say that I've found a lot of interesting ways I have a colleague who has students write self-ethnographies. And so when you couch it into a known genre of a field, I think that kind of distancing might have been something I would have responded positively to as an undergraduate writer. Almost like pretend you're doing this to yourself, right? So there's a kind of fiction to it in a way, or a layer to it. I've also really enjoyed having students read Young's article about, I forget the title, Can They Use Their Own English, I think is the title of it, right? Which is about African-American English in the classroom and in academic writing. And I think that kind of essay can liberate students to embracing their own language, as long as they're saying something to someone else in the academic context, right? So it's about that kind of communication. And I think y'all have given me some thoughts here too about how other kinds of nonfiction language can connect to the academic interests that we're charged to teach. So thank you.
Yeah, the big question, the dilemma is, how do you encourage students to write in a way that would be, I guess, appropriate for academia, but also have them try to write in a way that is actually evidence of their own writing voice? And if you're talking about Young or others, that then takes on additional dimensions. But I think if you ask people, Herbert Cole's Not Learning is really good about this. His chapter, I Won't Learn From You, is good about, if people feel as though what you're really asking them to do is to be a false version of themselves or to change in fundamental ways, I think most of us would reject that ask. Are there ways to encourage students to write like academics, write like themselves at the same time? I wish that there was the answer to that, but I think that's a great dilemma to be working within, Bethany, as you're trying to figure out how to get people to write about stuff that may matter to them, and that will make them feel vulnerable. And Philip, you're right. Like, how could you assign an assignment where you're like, all right, here's an assignment for a grade, write about yourself, I'm forcing you to do it. A lot of people will really hate that. Right. But can you do literacy narrative or autoethnography, something that's more, it may hook them in a way that they find acceptable. I think that's a good way to slide that in.